She drew a white chalk line across a stranger's floor. Then she looked at the cowboy who had found her in the dust and said, "This side is mine." Elias Ward did not laugh. He did not step closer. He only set the lamp down, backed away from the line, and answered, "Then I'll guard the other side." Outside, the storm came down hard enough to shake the nails from the roof. By morning, Mara Estrella woke in his arms. The chalk line was broken under his boots. Her 2 satchels were still clutched against her chest, and the bed in the corner had never been touched. Cinder Wash had always been a place where men drew lines and pretended the earth obeyed them. Fence lines, claim lines, rail lines, survey lines scratched in red pencil across maps no rain had ever touched. But the desert had its own handwriting. It wrote in gullies, flood scars, dry grass, and water that disappeared until the hour it returned with teeth. Mara had learned that before she ever reached Juniper Crossing. She was 23, a Tewa Pueblo schoolteacher with a long black braid, a faded indigo shawl, and a silver corn pendant worn smooth by her thumb. She carried 2 canvas satchels, one filled with primers, chalk, slate pencils, and a roll of names the school board had promised to pay for. The other held the old things no board had sent for, a folded water ledger, a hand-copied map, a tin cup, 3 kernels of blue corn sewn into a cloth square by her grandmother. The hiring letter said 21 pupils, 8 weeks of winter term, $28 a month, room if available, board if Christian households agreed. No household had agreed. So when the freight wagon left her at the Cinder Wash way station 2 miles short of town, the driver tipped his hat without meeting her eyes and said he had orders not to go farther after dusk. Mara watched him turn his team around. She did not call after him. Pride was not the same as safety, but it had kept her standing longer than comfort ever had. The station had once served stagecoaches. Now it leaned beside the dry wash, with one wall buckled, one window missing, and an old sign swinging from a nail as if it were trying to leave. Wind slid through the cracks and lifted dust in small, nervous breaths. Mara set her satchels against the wall and sat between them. She slept that way with one hand on the water ledger and the other near the small bone-handled knife inside her boot. Elias Ward had not meant to find anyone. He had ridden out from his claim to check a break in the lower fence before the storm hit. He was a farrier when horses needed him, a blacksmith when iron broke, and a cowboy when hunger made repair work too thin. He lived alone in a 2-room cabin beyond the cottonwoods where he could hear rain before he saw it and trouble before it had a name. The war had taken his brothers. The border years had taken his sleep. The West had left him with hands steady enough to mend what other men ruined. He saw the satchels first, then the braid, then the lamp turned low, fighting for a little circle of gold in the ruined room. Mara woke before he spoke. Her eyes found the revolver at his hip. Then his hands held open. Then the careful distance between his boots and her blanket. "There's a storm coming out of the west," he said. "This wash fills fast." "I am not lost," she answered. "No, Mom," he said. But water does not ask. She stood slowly, gathered both satchels herself, and walked past him into the bruised purple dusk. He did not touch her bags. He did not offer his arm. He simply led his horse close enough for her to mount if she chose. That mattered. Mercy that grabs too quickly can feel too much like capture. She climbed up behind the saddle and held the rolled blanket, not his coat. Elias walked the horse through the darkening wash while lightning walked behind the hills. By the time they reached his cabin, rain had begun striking the dust in fat black coins. Inside was plain order: iron stove, 2 chairs, a table made from a freight crate, tools hung on pegs, a narrow bed beneath a window, a stack of firewood, a shelf of cups, all dented, all clean. He lit the second lamp and placed it on the table. "You can sleep by the stove," he said. "I'll take the porch if the rain allows it. Chair by the door if it doesn't." Mara looked at the bed, then at him. She took a piece of chalk from her satchel, bent to the plank floor, and drew a line from the stove stone to the wall. "This side is mine." Elias studied the line, then stepped back until his heels touched the door. "Yes, Mom." He handed her a folded blanket by sliding it across the boards with his boot. He set a tin cup of coffee near the chalk, not over it. Then he hung his revolver on a peg behind him and sat facing the door. The rain hardened. For a while, only the roof spoke. Mara drank after he drank. She ate after he ate. She watched the room learn the shape of her caution and not resent it. After midnight, the wash roared awake. It started as a low body of sound beneath the thunder. Then it struck the cabin stones and climbed. Elias was on his feet before the first board snapped from the porch. "Mara," he said. She was already sitting up, knife in one hand, satchel strap in the other. The lower wall bowed inward. Water pushed under the door in a black sheet. A shelf jarred loose. The lamp flame jumped. Elias grabbed the table and dragged it against the weak wall, but the force outside hit again, heavier. A roof beam cracked. There are moments when respect has to move faster than permission. Elias crossed the chalk line. He caught Mara just as the beam came down where her shoulder had been. He lifted her with one arm, swept both satchels with the other, and shoved through the back door into the rain. She fought him for half a breath, then saw the broken timber, the water, the lamp gone out. He carried her up the rise to the cottonwood, boots slipping in mud, breath rough in his chest. He did not put her down until the ground held steady. When he set her on her feet, he stepped back at once. The night flashed white. Mara looked toward the cabin. Through the open door she could see the chalk line dissolving under muddy water, white dust breaking apart and drifting into the flood. Elias stood hatless in the rain. "I crossed it," he said. "You had to. That doesn't make it nothing." Mara tightened her grip on the satchels. "No," she said. "It makes it a line you understood." By dawn, the flood had dropped and left the cabin yard littered with brush, silt, and one dead branch long as a rifle. The bed was dry. The floor was ruined. The chalk had vanished. Elias made coffee on an outdoor fire because the stove would not draw. Mara sat on a saddle blanket with her satchels between her knees and steam lifting from her cup. Morning light found the damage without pity. The porch steps were gone. The lower planks were buckled. The little garden had been scoured down to roots. Elias looked at it all and said only, "Could have been worse." Mara almost smiled. "That is a hard prayer," she said. "It's the one I know." He took her to Juniper Crossing after breakfast. The town sat where the freight road bent toward a ridge of black rock and scrubbed cedar. False front stores stood shoulder to shoulder along the main street. A livery, a mercantile, a dry goods room, a sheriff's office with more shadow than law. Beyond them, an adobe schoolhouse leaned near an old acequia ditch, its bell frame empty, its roof patched in 3 colors of tin. Mara looked at the empty frame. Elias followed her eyes. "No bell? Not yet." From her satchel she lifted a small, cracked brass bell no bigger than a melon. It had been wrapped in wool. One edge was split. The handle had been repaired with wire. "My uncle rang this at the day school near San Ildefonso," she said. "When the children heard it, they knew no man with a whip was calling. Only lessons. Elias did not answer too quickly. That's worth hanging, he said. The school board had left the schoolhouse unlocked because there was nothing inside worth stealing, at least by their measure. 12 benches. A blackboard split down one side, a stove with a rusted belly, a bucket, a broom, and a stack of readers printed before half the children were born. Mara stepped into the room and stood still. Dust layered the desks. Mouse droppings lined the corners. One wall smelled of damp earth. Still, light entered through the east windows and lay across the benches in clean bars. She took a cloth from her satchel and wiped the board. Then she wrote one sentence. A line can divide, a line can also guide. Elias read it from the doorway and felt something in his chest tighten. He had spent years thinking lines were for keeping trouble out. Property lines. Enemy lines. The line between what a man said and what he had to live with afterward. He had never considered that a line could teach a child where to begin. By noon, the first children came. A miner's daughter with coal dust worked into her cuffs. 2 brothers with patched knees and one shared primer. A Mexican boy whose mother washed clothes behind the livery. 3 Pueblo children who stood near the back until Mara greeted them in a language that made their faces change. A little girl named Annie Bell who was missing a front tooth and had brought a potato wrapped in paper because she thought teachers were always hungry. Mara accepted the potato as solemnly as a wage. She put slates in their hands. She showed them how to hold chalk without breaking it. She taught them letters by giving each one something that mattered. W for water, H for home, R for river, N for name. Outside, Elias fixed the empty bell frame. He worked with his sleeves rolled, hammer taps measured and quiet. Town women passed by pretending not to look. Men paused in the street and looked openly. Juniper Crossing had hired Mara because the county inspector was coming, and a school with no teacher meant tax trouble. But hiring on paper was one thing. Watching a Pueblo woman write English on a town blackboard was another. By afternoon, the cracked brass bell hung in the frame. Elias tugged the rope. The sound was not pretty. It was better than pretty. It was alive. Children came out laughing. Mara stood beneath the frame and looked up at the bell, as if it had found its voice after a long sickness. "Thank you," she said. Elias put on a hat to hide what the words did to him. Wasn't much. It was enough. For 3 days the school held. Then the survey stakes appeared. They came in a straight red line from the ridge, down past the old spring, across the acequia, and through the schoolyard so cleanly it seemed drawn by a hand that had never carried water. The stakes belonged to Ojo de Cobra Mining Company. Everybody knew the company was coming. Men talked of wages, storekeepers talked of credit, the sheriff talked of progress. But Mara knew the sound beneath those words. The company needed water for its stamp mill. 30,000 gallons a day when the ore ran hard, more in summer. The nearest water that did not already belong to cattlemen was the spring above the school and the old ditch that carried it down to gardens, wash basins, and fields smaller than Pride but large enough to keep people alive. There was a ledger in Mara's second satchel, copied from church records and county papers, showing the ditch had been maintained since 1851 by the same families now being told the water was user public resource, unused. Mara had seen that word before. It meant someone powerful had failed to see the hands doing the using. On the 4th morning, she found a red stake hammered 3 feet from the school steps. The children circled it. "Is it a fence?" Annie Bell asked. "No," Mara said. A boy touched the red paint and pulled his fingers back as though it burned. "What is it?" Mara looked toward the spring trail. "A question," she said, "and we will learn how to answer it." That day's lesson changed. She drew a map on the blackboard. Ridge, spring, ditch, school, homes, fields. Then she drew the red survey line crossing them all. Some of the children watched as if a snake had entered the room. "Lines on paper can be useful," she said, "but they can also lie when the hand holding the pencil refuses to read the ground." She opened the water ledger. Names filled the pages. Dates, repairs, ditch, days. Families who had cleared silt after summer storms and broken ice in winter. She did not tell the children what to believe. She taught them to read what was already written. That was what frightened the company. Not anger, not ceremony, not speeches. A room full of children learning that ink could be challenged by older ink. 2 men came before school, let out. One was Deputy Pike, narrow-eyed and stiff in a clean vest. The other was Rusk Bellamy, the mining company's field boss, with red dust on his boots and a smile that had never done honest work. Bellamy did not remove his hat inside the schoolhouse. "Miss Estrella," he said, "we've had concerns." Mara closed the ledger but kept her hand on it. "Concerns usually have names." He smiled wider. "Best not to trouble the children with matters above them. The ditch runs past their homes." "The ditch," Deputy Pike said, "is under review." Mara looked at the red stake outside the door. "So is my lesson." Bellamy stepped closer to the desk. "You were hired to teach reading, not to stir up old claims. This is reading." His eyes dropped to the ledger. "You keep county property?" "My copy." "Copies confuse people." "So does theft." The children went silent. Elias heard the silence from the street. He had brought a repaired stove latch and was standing just outside the open window when Bellamy reached for the ledger. Mara placed one palm flat on the book. "Do not cross that line," she said. The words were quiet, but Elias knew them. They were not about chalk this time. Bellamy laughed once and took the ledger anyway. Elias moved before the laugh finished. He entered the schoolhouse without drawing his gun, without raising his voice, and without looking away from Bellamy's hand. "You picked up the teacher's book," he said. Bellamy held it higher. "You her guard dog now, Ward?" "No," Elias said. "Dogs bite before thinking. I'm still thinking." That made Deputy Pike nervous. Bellamy tossed the ledger onto Mara's desk as though returning it proved he had never meant harm. "This town won't let a schoolwoman block a mill." Mara picked up the ledger and slid it into her satchel. "No," she said, "but a town may decide it needs water more than a mill needs obedience." Bellamy's face changed. "There are men who can tolerate refusal only until it is spoken in front of witnesses." He left slowly because leaving fast would have looked too much like losing. By evening, the school board met behind the mercantile. Mara was not invited. Elias was not invited. The mothers who hauled water were not invited. The children whose names filled the roll were not invited. Men who had never swept the school floor decided whether the school was orderly enough to deserve a teacher. The next morning, a notice was nailed to the door. "School suspended pending review of improper instruction." Mara read it twice. Then she took the nail out without tearing the paper, folded the notice, and placed it on her desk. Children gathered in the yard, whispering. Some held slates against their chests. Some had brought lunches wrapped in cloth. The Pueblo children stood close together, faces still as carved stone. Annie Bell looked up at Mara. "Do we go home?" Mara wanted to say no. The word rose in her mouth with heat behind it. But teaching is not the same as using children as a shield. She had been used that way once by people who called it policy. So she knelt until her eyes were level with Annie's. "For today," she said, "you carry your lessons home." A boy pointed at the red stake. "What about that?" Mara looked at the line of stakes marching toward the spring. "That lesson is not finished." The darkest hour came that night, not because the men returned, not because Elias failed to come, not because the school was locked by sundown and the bell rope cut so short no child could reach it. It came when Mara sat alone on the school steps with the ledger in her lap and felt tired enough to understand why people stopped fighting. The town did not need to beat her. It only had to wait for her to become practical. Practical said, take the $28, teach letters without maps, and leave before spring. Practical said water disputes belonged to men with offices. Practical said a woman who had already been left at one road should not dare the next one to do the same. Elias found her there after dark. He carried no rifle, only a lantern, a coil of rope, and 2 cups of coffee wrapped in cloth to keep them warm. He sat on the ground below the steps, leaving space between them. For a long while, neither spoke. At last Mara said, "When I was 9, an agent told my mother that school would make me useful." He meant useful to someone else. Elias looked at the dust between his boots. "My mother sent me anyway," she continued. "She said if they were going to put their letters in my mouth, I should learn to bite with them." A small sound escaped Elias, not a laugh, something closer to pain recognizing kin. Mara ran her thumb along the ledger's edge. "I thought I came here to teach children. But the first lesson is always the same." "What lesson?" She looked toward the spring trail, dark under the ridge. "That we belong before someone writes permission." Elias held out 1 cup of coffee, stopping short of her knee. She took it. He did not tell her to keep fighting. He did not tell her she was brave. He did not spend words dressing helplessness as comfort. He said, "Bellamy is moving his crew at first light. I saw extra chain at the freight yard." Mara's hand tightened around the cup. "To the spring?" "Yes." The night seemed to lean closer. She stood. Elias stood too, slower. "I need the ledger read where people cannot pretend they did not hear it," she said. "At the spring, at the school. The school is locked." Mara looked at the cut bell rope hanging in the dark. "Then we start with the bell." At first light, Elias climbed the school frame and replaced the cut rope with his own rawhide line. He tied it low enough for a child to reach. Then he stepped down and handed the end to Mara. The street was still blue with dawn. Windows watched without admitting it. Mara pulled. The sound ran down Juniper Crossing, crooked and bright. It woke babies. It startled horses. It brought women to doorways with flour on their hands and men onto porches, pretending they had only come out for air. Mara rang again. Children came first. They always did, when hope sounded enough like mischief. Annie Bell arrived with her missing tooth grin and her slate under one arm. The miner's daughter came with her little brother. The washerwoman's son came running barefoot through dust. The Pueblo children came with their grandmother, who carried a water jar on her hip as if the jar itself had been summoned. Then came the mothers. Then the men who owed those mothers meals, washing, mending, and peace. Bellamy rode in from the freight yard with 6 workers and Deputy Pike behind him. They had chains, picks, and 2 survey poles. They did not look like men going to court. They looked like men going to make court unnecessary. Bellamy saw the crowd and smiled as if he had expected applause. "School is suspended," he called. Mara stood on the top step with the ledger against her chest. "Then this is not school," she said. "This is reading." She opened the ledger. Bellamy dismounted. Deputy Pike shifted in the saddle. Elias stood at the bottom of the steps, hat in hand, not in front of Mara but just beside the space where trouble would have to pass. He had learned that protection is not the same as taking the center. Mara read the first entry. April 17, 1851. East ditch cleared from spring to lower gardens. 12 families present. 3 days labor. She turned the page. June 3, 1856. Flood broke north bank. Repaired by hand before planting. Another page. January 9, 1862. Ice cut by lantern before sunrise. Water delivered to school children and widows first. The crowd had grown still. Dates do a particular kind of work when spoken aloud. They make memory stand up straight. Bellamy scoffed. Old church notes. Sentiment. The company filing is current. Mara looked at Annie Bell. "Read the line I marked." The child swallowed. Her hands trembled around the ledger, but she read, "County receipt, 1874. Ditch maintenance tax accepted from families of the Spring Road." A murmur moved through the crowd. Mara turned to the washerwoman's son. Next, he read slowly, stumbling once, then finding his footing. Public water use recorded. No abandonment. Deputy Pike's face lost color. Bellamy snapped, "Children don't make law." "No," Mara said. They read what men hoped they would not. The line struck harder than any slap, because everyone there knew it was true. The company had counted on silence, on shame, on people too busy hauling water to preserve paper, on mothers who could sign only with crosses, on children who would not notice a red stake until the trench was already cut. Bellamy reached for the ledger again. Elias moved half a step, nothing more. That half step carried the weight of everything he had chosen not to do. Bellamy stopped. From the back of the crowd, a woman named Rosa Tellez lifted her chin. Her hands were red from soap, and her apron was wet through. "My boys clear that ditch every August," she said. "Company never sent one shovel." Miriam Hale from the bakery spoke next. "My bread rises because I have water before dawn. You take the spring, you take my oven." The miner with coal in his beard looked at Bellamy's workers. "My wife hauls that water. You want the ditch? Carry every bucket she carries first." One by one, the town remembered the price of what it had almost sold. Not all at once, not nobly, not cleanly, but enough. Deputy Pike dismounted and asked for the ledger in a voice that had finally found the difference between law and fear. Mara handed it to him after making him say, in front of everyone, that he was receiving it as evidence and would return it. That mattered too. Lines could guide, but they had to be named. At the spring, the company workers stood with picks in their hands and no instructions strong enough to lift them. The red stakes remained, bright and foolish, crossing the old ditch. Bellamy pulled one from the ground and threw it aside. "This is delay," he said. Mara stepped down from the school steps. "No," she answered. "This is the ground correcting the map." By noon, the sheriff sent a rider to the county seat. By evening, the school suspension was withdrawn without apology. By the next week, Ojo de Cobre Mining Company shifted its water plan downriver at a cost its owners complained about in letters nobody in Juniper Crossing cared to hear. The spring remained. The ditch ran. The school opened. Mara did not become beloved overnight. Towns do not wash themselves that quickly. Some men still lowered their voices when she passed. Some women still called her that teacher when they thought kindness might cost them standing. But the children came. 21 became 26. then 30. Elias built 2 more benches from freight lumber. Rosa Tellez scrubbed the stove until it shone black. Miriam Hale brought bread every Monday and said it was because children spelled better when fed, which was not science but still proved true. Deputy Pike returned the ledger wrapped in oilcloth, and though he did not apologize, he removed his hat when he handed it over. Mara hung the oilcloth near the board, not the ledger itself, only the wrap. The proof went back into her satchel. A lesson did not have to sit in the open to remain present. Spring changed the town by inches. Grass took the ditch banks. Cottonwood buds opened soft and green. The schoolyard filled with footprints crossing over the places where red stakes had been. Elias repaired his flooded cabin plank by plank. Mara visited twice a week to help with the ruined floor because she said a line that saved. A life deserved a proper grave. Together they pulled the warped boards and set new ones. On the last evening of the work, she took chalk from her pocket and drew a short white line across the fresh plank near the stove. Elias looked at it. "Still yours?" he asked. Mara studied the mark. Then she shook her head. "This one is for memory." He waited. She knelt and pressed the chalk into his palm. "You draw the other half." His fingers closed around it carefully, as if chalk could bruise. He crouched and drew the line wider, not longer. A threshold instead of a wall. Mara watched him do it. The room held its breath around them. Elias stood first and stepped back. "I was alone so long," he said. "I mistook emptiness for doing no harm." Mara looked toward the door, where evening light had entered and laid itself across both sides of the white mark. "My mother said a house is not proved by who it keeps out," she said, "only by whether a person can enter without leaving herself outside." Elias set the chalk on the table. "I can learn that." "You already began." She crossed the line by choice. Not because the storm forced her. Not because a man carried her. Not because the town finally made room. She crossed it holding her own satchel, wearing her own name, bringing with her every road that had tried to turn her around. Elias did not reach for her. He opened the door wider. That was the moment love entered the room. Not as hunger, not as rescue, not as a bargain dressed in tenderness, as room. Months later, the cracked brass bell still rang crooked over Juniper Crossing. Children learned to write their names in hands so bold, their parents kept the papers folded in trunks. They learned water was not empty because rich men had not noticed it. They learned maps were useful only when the mapmaker had bothered to respect the ground. And on clear mornings, when Mara rang the bell, Elias would sometimes pause at his forge and listen. The sound crossed the road, crossed the ditch, crossed the old survey line that no longer mattered. It found the repaired cabin at Cinder Wash and slipped through the doorway where a chalk mark still brightened the floor. Once that line had told a frightened woman where a stranger must stop. Now it reminded 2 people where respect had begun. And no man in Juniper Crossing ever looked at a line the same way again.